The backlash against Israel's Western-backed crimes will fuel the far right. A new Pew survey has found that a majority of Americans now have a negative view of Israel, with 53% of respondents now holding an unfavorable view of the Zionist state, up from 42% just 3 years ago. This comes as Benjamin Netanyahu announces after his latest meeting with Donald Trump that negotiations with Iran will necessarily have to include a, quote, Libyan-style dismantling of the nation's civilian nuclear infrastructure in order to avoid the war that the U.S. is openly preparing to wage. This is, of course, a complete non-starter condition. It also comes as Trump's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services announces that it's going to be screening the social media posts of immigrants for anti-Semitic speech, which of course in practice means criticism of Israel and its atrocities. This is just the latest in the Trump administration's relentless efforts to prevent Americans from seeing or hearing any political speech which goes against Washington's official position on Israel. Developments like these can be expected to assist the rise of the far right in the West. U.S. public opinion is turning hard against Israel as both parties bend over backward to send it expensive weapons and silence its critics. And U.S. public opinion is seldom good at making subtle distinctions. Anti-Semitism is fast becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. As Westerners tire of having their speech rights taken away by their government to protect the interests of a state that's committing genocide under a Star of David banner, a lot of them are going to blame Jews for this. As Western governments bend over backwards to help murder Israel's enemies in the Middle East, a lot of Westerners are going to blame Jews. As the drums for war with Iran beat louder and louder, and parents fear their children will be sent off to die for Israel, many will blame this on Jews. I am not saying this is a good thing. It is a very bad thing. But it's also reality. As more and more Westerners grow disgusted with Israel and their government's support for its depravity, the far left is going to try to talk to the public about the difference between Zionism and Judaism, about the Western Empire and its interests in the Middle East. And meanwhile, the far right is going to blame it all on Jews. Which of these sounds like the easier argument to make? Which is simpler? Which is more digestible? Which is less challenging to the cognitive biases of a population that's already been propagandized to view their nation as inherently virtuous? A perspective which highlights the West's culpability for the atrocities we're backing in the Middle East? Or a cartoonish perspective which blames it all on the subversive manipulations of a sinister religious minority? Those of us who oppose the criminality of Israel and its Western allies from the left we'll do all we can to keep the far right's arguments from gaining traction. But it won't be our fault when we fail. It will be the fault of the Western governments who spent all this time stomping out the civil liberties of their citizenry in the name of fighting anti-Semitism while raining military explosives on the Middle East and backing the slaughter of tens of thousands of children under a Star of David flag. We can expect to see some nasty hate crimes against Jews in the future, which the Zionists will be all too happy about because then they can point to those incidents and say, this is why we need Israel. This is why we need a Jewish state to protect us. But of course, this won't just affect Jews. Immigrants, racial minorities, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized communities will all be harmed by the rise of white nationalist factions whose popularity benefits from an increase of anti-Jewish sentiment in our society. The mainstream MAGA movement, as ugly as that's been, is still far less dangerous to these groups than the overtly Hitlerite factions will be if they come into significant power in the future. This does seem to be where things could be headed, especially if the economic situation gets as dire as it looks like it might get, and even more so if there's a war with Iran. It can all be easily avoided by simply ceasing to stomp out free speech to protect Israel, ceasing Western warmongering in places like Iran and Yemen, and ceasing to back Israel's genocidal atrocities against Palestinians. But it looks like our rulers are bound and determined to drag us into a very dark direction instead.